Top. Sorry, I think I was talking on mute there, but welcome everybody. I'm Lawrence Churchill, the chair-elect of ILC, with a professional background in insurance, pensions and investment. It's my pleasant duty to chair today's webinar. I'd like to take a few moments to introduce the topic and indeed to introduce our expert speakers today. At different times in our lives, within our families and across society, we either give support to or depend on help from others, or a bit of both. During childhood and the later stages of our lives, we're more likely to rely on the working age population to fund the education and health services we need, and on our families to care for us. It's something our society takes for granted. But as our population ages and fertility rates reduce, resources are stretched, and this social contract is challenged. During this webinar, we're going to hear about the research that from Vivian Burrows, Senior Research Fellow at the ILC, has been working on with Clive Bolton, CEO of Life Assurance at M&G, and his team to explore some of these challenges and focus on the role of investment in supporting welfare across generations. To respond to this work, we're also delighted to hear from two experts in this area. Professor Bobby Duffy, Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London, and Molly Broom, Economist at the Resolution Foundation. Molly's work at the Resolution Foundation focuses on intergenerational fairness. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions to panelists, and we'll try to address as many of these as time allows for. So without more ado, I'd like to introduce Vivi again and hand over to you to present.
Recording in progress.
Sorry. Thank you very much. And I'd like to thank M&G again for supporting this project. And also thanks the various experts who I have spoken to throughout the project for their insight and expertise that have informed the development of this report. Now, when we think about the intergenerational contract, most of us probably think about the system of taxes and government spending in areas like pensions, education, and health. And in fact, these are a core part of the intergenerational contract, but they're not the only part. So the intergenerational contract also involves families and the financial services sector. So while transfers between generations in the public sector are important, it's also important to think about the role that families and financial services sector play in this process in redistributing resources across generations and supporting intergenerational welfare. And that was really one of the things we were trying to, or we wanted to highlight throughout this project. So thinking about the roles that these different actors play and thinking about the challenges and limitations that they face. So thinking first about the role of families. So we know that financial transfers between family members in the forms of gifts and inheritances are becoming increasingly important. So in 2020, an average of 6% of adults reported receiving a financial gift worth £500 or more from a family member. Now, this might not seem like a lot, but this proportion is increasing, and it's also significantly higher among younger age groups. So as you can see here, among 20 to 34-year-olds, there are around roughly 11% of people reported receiving a gift. The size of the gift varies quite a lot. So the average is around £2,000, but there's a significant minority receiving gifts worth £20,000 or more. Now, if you look at inheritances, these are also important, but the proportion of people receiving inheritances is slightly smaller, so it's around 4%. And as you'd expect, these are also received typically later in life. So the age group that receives, or that's more likely to receive an inheritance are people aged between 55 and 64. And as you might expect, with sort of trends in population aging, the ages at which most of us or can expect to receive an inheritance are likely to increase further in the future. So financial transfers are important, but it's not just about money when we think about these sort of flows of support within families. As part of this project, we commissioned an original survey from YouGov. And one of the questions that we asked respondents to think about the types of support they receive from family. So not just financial support, but other forms of support. And I've summarized some of the results in the slide on this graph that you can see here. Now, general financial support is still the largest form of support, with around 30% of people saying they received some form of financial support. This is, of course, higher than the figures we've just been looking at because the question here is a bit more general. So we're not restricting people to think about sort of sizable financial gifts worth £500 or more, but more thinking about financial support they receive from family more generally. I think what's interesting to see here is the range of other types of support that are also important. So whether this is receiving support from family members of travel, accommodation, carrying out household chores, childcare, for example. So all of these flows of support are important for sort of strengthening these ties between generations. But it's important to remember that not everyone has access to the same resources or the ability to provide the same level of financial support. And research has found, for example, that people on higher incomes are not only more likely to receive financial support from family members, but they also receive on average higher amounts. So there is a risk that these financial transfers within families will perpetuate existing wealth inequalities. Now, if we think of the role of financial institutions, they also play a vital role in helping us manage our money across our lives. And our research suggests that there is a strong appetite for saving across all generations. So one of the questions we asked in the survey was we asked people to think about what they would do with a sort of hypothetical £10,000 windfall. And the top answer among all age groups was to put at least some of that money towards savings. So just over 70% of 18 to 24-year-olds said they would put some of the money towards savings. And for other groups, it was around 50%. So of course, the types of financial products that people have available can make a huge difference here. And having financial products that have some element of collective risk sharing, so for example, with profit funds or collective defined contribution schemes, can help support intergenerational welfare by providing a sort of mechanism for balancing the distribution of returns across different generations of policyholders. But of course, it's important here that people understand enough about the financial products available, and also that they have the confidence or the support that they need to make these decisions. And here I think that the level of trust in financial institutions and the products that are available is really important as well. Now, how funds are invested could also have a significant impact on the welfare of current and future generations. So if funds are invested in, or the choice of assets in which funds are invested can, for example, help achieve or help support economic growth, but also help the government achieve a wide range of societal goals. So for example, supporting the transition to net zero. Now, in our survey, respondents, when asked to sort of consider the trade-off between a concern for social and environmental considerations and higher returns, respondents tended to favour higher returns over the social and environmental considerations. But thinking about the social and environmental considerations when making investment decisions, particularly around retirement, was considered to be important. And there's been other research in this area that has found that increasingly people do place more weight on not just the returns that they can expect to get, but also how their money is being invested. So lastly, turning to the role of the government plays a very important role, as we know, in supporting intergenerational welfare, with more than half of all government spending going towards programs such as social security, health, education, and long-term care. And again, it's not just, obviously the money is important, but it's not just about the money here as well. So these economic and social policies also shape society's attitudes and the social norms related to things like caring for children and older people, saving for retirement, education, and so on. But as we know, and has already been touched on in Lawrence's introduction, increases in life expectancy, or the fact that we are now on average living longer and fertility rates have fallen, are putting pressure on public finances alongside the sort of historic weak economic growth. And in fact, the majority of people feel, in the survey we carried out, the majority of people over 25 felt that younger generations, or today's younger generations, can't expect to receive the same level of government support as current retirees once they reach their retirement age. So this is all putting a strain on this intergenerational contract. So the question is, well, what can we do about this? And within this report, alongside recommendations for increasing investment in health and prevention and supporting financial literacy, we've also identified 3 core sets of recommendations. So the first is to provide more support for the retirement incomes of future generations of retirees. And this could involve, for example, setting out plans for increasing the contribution rates into workplace pensions, and also broadening access to these pensions to groups that are currently excluded, such as the self-employed. Another core policy is around democratizing access to savings products from birth. So, for example, by providing savings accounts for all children from birth by default, to try and help foster or nurture this a culture of saving. And lastly, I think it's important to support long-term investments to pool risk for the benefit of both current and future generations. So, for example, through products such as with-profit funds and collective defined contribution schemes. And together, we think these sorts of policies or changes will help mitigate some of the challenges that are currently putting pressure on the intergenerational contract and help secure stronger foundations for it for the future. So thank you very much. And I would like to hand over to Clive Bolton from M&G to share his reflections from an industry perspective.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Vivian, for that introduction and summary of your report. I'll just say M&G is proud to have worked with the ILC on this important project, and I'd like to extend my thanks to David and the team for their partnership and hard work on delivering this piece of work. The findings are stark, and they're a reminder that the UK's intergenerational contract needs to be strengthened to keep pace with the changing societal needs. To put simply, we need to strengthen the principle that investing today is a down payment for tomorrow. The good news is the intergenerational contract is still functioning as it has done for many years. You can see, I hope that a graph can be, here we go. This graph shows that those aged 20 to 69 power this intergenerational contract as the net contributors, supporting both young and old. But clearly the older groups are growing and living longer, and this is presenting new challenges. But there are reasons for optimism. The graph also shows that the 60 to 69 age group are net contributors, which might not have been so evident in the past, which is likely to grow in future years as more people of that age take up part-time work, for instance. And understanding these changing trends supporting the different age groups is now a critical public policy challenge. And if we were to energise the intergenerational contract, we need to make sure it evolves and gets stronger. And I say that because most people have lived their lives partially defined by that in the society in which we live, without actually giving it any consideration. And this idea and purpose of this report is to give a little bit more information and make something that is implicit but important a little bit more explicit. So the intergenerational contract, so why us? The intergenerational contract is part of M&G's DNA. We use our life business, of which I am the CEO, to deploy large-scale capital by partnering with our asset management experts who identify and actively manage those investments long-term. And we've done that for 175 years, providing financial security for customers, making a tangible impact on the real economy, those productive assets that we can actually see about us as we go about our daily lives. Without creating a cultural shift around the benefits of long-term savings for younger generations, we risk falling short of our ambitions of growth as a country. And in doing so, we'll also fail to invest in the very infrastructure that all generations enjoy and rely on for social cohesion and prosperity. It supports our welfare system, our health service, and our schools. Ultimately, the intergenerational contract is founded on the shared values of trust, reciprocity, and fairness, built on the premise that investing today is a down payment for tomorrow. But as the findings show, this contract is increasingly under threat due to the demographic changes, low growth, and rising inequality. It is illustrated by the plummeting share of wealth held by younger people, with under 40s holding just 4% of wealth, down from 7.5% in 2010. As industry leaders and policymakers, we should be in no doubt that it is working age people who will fund social infrastructure of the future that will benefit all generations. And it is our collective and individual interests to strengthen and safeguard this contract in the UK. And it starts with firstly ensuring our support for future generations' retirement income, to democratizing the access for savings investment products from birth to create a cultural reset, and developing and improving investment vehicles which pool risks across those generations. At M&G, we have one of the largest with-profit funds in Europe, approximately £129 billion, which contains our flagship product, Proof Fund, which supports 450,000 savers. This is a large pool of capital which allows us to spread and invest with long-term horizons, thereby strengthening the intergenerational contract. By investing at scale, we can achieve greater diversification across asset classes and geographies, including those productive assets which require a lot more expertise than and skill than accessing some of the publicly available assets, and by which I mean things like wind farms, and also businesses which are wholly faced in the UK that haven't been big enough to get into the stock market. And with-profit funds are a good example of such vehicles that pool risks across generations. These funds work on the premise that each generation of policyholders defer some of their bonuses to invest in future generations, as previous generations did before them, allowing our current policyholders to become investors. It aims to be a virtuous circle. The intergenerational contract is therefore analogous with-profit funds, as they have the ability to both service the interests of all group and make real-time contributions to the real economy. So investing today through large pooled diversified funds which can spread risks is a down payment on the prosperity of future generations. And therefore, in conclusion, pension investments will play a critical role in underpinning and sustaining the intergenerational contract. It is in all our interest to better communicate what that contract is, how it underpins the society that we live in, how it is crucial that how it is a crucial principle for driving growth and building a compelling case for why it works for all age groups in responses to today's challenge. My hope for the future is that through all the right policy platforms, the partnership with financial services sector, we can preserve and evolve the intergenerational contract for generations to come. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Clive. Very, very interesting. And I loved your phrase about investing today as a down payment for tomorrow. Perhaps we might come back to concepts like that a little later in our discussions. But now I'd like to introduce the first of our two resident experts to come in and give us their reflections on the report and their perspectives on what could have been in the report but perhaps wasn't. I mean, let's broaden out the issue about how to strengthen this intergenerational contract. So Molly, could I introduce you for your reactions to the research?
Yeah, thank you so much for inviting me here to speak today, and thank you for the really interesting research. And I think it echoes a lot of the findings of Resolution Resolution Foundation research, which emphasizes the difficulty in which young people face in accumulating wealth. So I thought I'd present a couple of slides on that topic. So if we move to the next slide. So as the report highlights, the total value of household wealth in Britain has increased faster than income over recent decades, rising from around 3 times GDP in the mid-1980s to over 7 times GDP on the eve of the pandemic. And what we can see from this chart is that the largest beneficiaries of that post-financial crisis wealth increase has tended to be older age groups. We can see that those that were in their early 60s in 2018 to 20, so this group broadly aligns with the youngest baby boomers, had nearly £160,000 more wealth than a person of the same age back in 2006 to 8. Now, in contrast, the typical person in their late 30s in 2018 to 20, so the eldest millennials, had around £25,000 less wealth than those of the same age back in 2006 to 8. So as a result, absolute wealth gaps between age groups have grown larger. And what we find is that the wealth gap between those in their early 30s and those in their early 60s stood at around £440,000 in 2018 to 20. Now, unfortunately, we don't have timely data on household balance sheets, so the Resolution Foundation has had to undertake some modelling to understand how household wealth has changed since the onset of the pandemic. And we do this by examining how asset prices have changed. So if we move to the next slide, we should show the results of our modelling. And what we find is that this higher interest rate environment that we find ourselves in over recent years has caused the value of household wealth to fall from around 7 times GDP on the pandemic to around 6 times GDP in our most recent estimates. And we can see that it's those who benefited most from the post-financial crisis wealth increase that have seen the largest falls in wealth in recent years. So median wealth of those who were in their 60s in 2018 to 20 is estimated to have fallen by 16% by Q3 of 2024, while at the same time wealth of those in their early 30s is estimated to have risen by 17%. So as a result, the gap in median wealth between these two age groups has shrunk by £86,000. So there is some good news on the intergenerational wealth gap front. However, the future still looks challenging for younger cohorts' wealth accumulation prospects. So if we move on to the next slide. So this is we're going to firstly look at pensions. So this is a chart from our 2023 intergenerational audit. And this shows the estimated and projected average pension wealth of full-time employees by the time they reach age 60 for each 5-year age cohort. And the key message from this chart is that younger generations are on track to reach retirement with smaller pension pots compared to the generations that came before them. So our modelling indicates that even with the good news of higher interest rates and better returns to saving, it's not enough to outweigh the decline in the availability of DB pension schemes, which tend to be much more generous than DC schemes, which a lot of younger generations hold today. In fact, even in this higher interest rate environment, so our modelling assumes that long-term interest rates settle at around 3%. If that's the case, millennials born in the early 1980s could reach age 60 with around £45,000 less in their pension pots than the youngest baby boomers. And this ultimately points to lower living standards in retirement among younger generations unless the saving behaviour of younger cohorts increases substantially. So moving on to the next slide, we'll look at housing. So we published a paper at the end of last year which showed that there had been some recovery in youth home ownership since the middle of the 2010s. However, a key question that we're often asked is whether millennials will be able to experience the same level of home ownership as previous generations, particularly the baby boomers. And this chart shows the results of a thought experiment that uses past data on prices, incomes, credit conditions, housing supply, to create home ownership projections for the future. The upper bound assumes that over the next 10 years, the younger cohorts face the same conditions in which we saw the strongest house price home ownership growth. So that's the period of 1981 to 1999, and that's a period characterized by credit liberalization, slower house price growth, and the right to buy policy. And the lower bound assumes a repeat of the conditions observed in 2005 to 2015, when home ownership saw the weakest growth rate. Again, a period that's characterized by constrained credit conditions and spiraling house price to income ratios. And we see that under very, very favorable conditions, millennial home ownership rates would catch up with the Gen X cohort by the age of 40. However, they would remain some 8 percentage points lower than the baby boomers at that age. So a difficult picture on youth home ownership looking ahead. So if we go on to the next slide, there's just a couple of points on what we might do to address some of these challenges that young people face when accumulating wealth. On the pension side, generally it's agreed that higher pension contributions are needed, and that's particularly important for middle and high earners. But we argue that this needs to come with greater flexibility in accessing pension saving to manage the tension between saving for retirement and saving for precautionary purposes, because we know lots of families in Britain don't have enough precautionary savings. So in previous work, we've proposed introducing a sidecar savings account similar to that successfully trialed by Nest Insight, which would enable people to build up an emergency savings buffer. But we've also proposed enabling savers to borrow from their pension pots to cover larger expenses, which is the norm in the US and tends to be, or evidence points to the fact that that has been quite successful for people who fall into or face larger financial shocks. Now, on the housing side, there are solutions that lots of people have been talking about for some time. We need to increase the supply of houses across all tenure types. And there appears to be a general consensus on this, with the government committing to deliver 1.5 million homes over the next Parliament. And so that's a supply side response, but we should also think about how we can dampen demand for housing, particularly as an investment asset, by reforming the way that we tax property in this country. And then finally, that's focused on home ownership, but there will be people who will remain in the social and private rented sector. So it's really important that we look to improve the quality and security of housing for people who remain in that form of tenure. So I think that's all I had to say. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Molly. Thank you very, very much for that. Some wonderful graphs in there and further information for us to ponder on. It seems pretty obvious that we should increase the rates of contributions for younger people, doesn't it? I mean, not uniquely younger people, but of course they'll be paying higher contributions for longer to try to smooth out some of those pensions outcomes that you predict. I'm sure we'll return to some of the provocations, I think, in your slides a little later. But let me now turn to Bobby and ask him to come in and give us your response to this, Bobby. Are we classifying the generations in the right way? Is this analysis useful and decision useful from that point of view? And other things that you might be interested in talking on. Over to you, Bobby.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Lawrence, and thanks for the invitation today. And look, I really welcome the report and ILC and M&G engaging in this issue more generally. It's an issue very close to my heart. Been looking at generational issues for the last 15 years, often from a political attitudinal point of view, but also economics, drawing on great work by Resolution Foundation and others. And I wrote a book called Generations a couple of years ago. because what we really need to do is separate what is useful to understand generationally and what isn't, what's the myths and the stereotypes. And that's part of that answer to your question, because I think what the report does is set out that there is a true generational nature of wealth and investment, in the sense that people born in similar socioeconomic circumstances but 15 to 20 years apart can expect very different economic outcomes on key things like housing and pension wealth, as Molly has outlined. Much of my work Oh, did I drop off?
Yes, Bobby did. Sorry.
No idea why that happened. That just went suddenly blank. Nothing else stopped. I'll just continue. So much of my work is in separating age, period, and cohort effects, as I said, and this is a true cohort effect, where younger generations have faced tougher times that have shaped lives and outcomes. Again, as some of the charts in the report and from Molly's presentation identify. And these are really important to identify true cohort effects, because they're difficult to move and won't change without intervention. And that's why the policy recommendations from the report are really important. But I'm also really pleased that the report doesn't frame this as pitting one generation against another, which can be the temptation when you look at things generationally. But the report helps to lay out just how interconnected we are. And it's a point I make a lot in the book. Whichever way you look at the evidence, there is really no sign of a coming generational war based on this type of economic resentment of different cohort outcomes. When I first started generational analysis 15, 20 years ago, I expected more active anger and action among the young, I would say, in some ways. But there are a number of very good reasons why there isn't. And I mean, most obvious is those family connections that we talk about in the report, which are driven both by practical and emotional factors. We don't want our parents and grandparents to be penalized to transfer things towards us, partly because we love them and partly because it might just cost us time and money if that support is taken away. More generally, one of the first studies that I did around this was with Demos, and which was a mix of qualitative and quantitative work. And there is a real strong belief in the UK that those who've contributed should receive support. We've got a very strong contributory principle that runs deep in us, and older people, having been around longer, have contributed the most. But there's a fourth reason as well, is that this lack of generational tension is also related to a unique fact about age and aging, is that we will inevitably pass through each of these age ranges ourselves if we don't die ahead of that time. So it's very unlike gender, race, ethnicity, even social class or income, where we can't avoid switching categories ourselves. So as a result, we see our own futures in the older people ahead of us, and that includes the level and nature of support that we'll get from government and from others. So that, in some ways, some of the findings in the report from the survey about people being less convinced that there's going to be that support in the future is a worrying sign, and one that we do need to address. Because again, as the report makes out, contrary to common misconceptions, the main outcome of taxation and welfare is lifetime redistribution, as the great John Hill's LSE was so good at explaining, the transfer of money between periods in someone's life rather than redistribution of money between different income groups. So when we see the system in those terms, the idea that younger generations will have a strong instinct to tear up the intergenerational contract makes much less sense. If generation shifts the balance away from current old, they will likely lose out themselves at a later stage. So it's no surprise in the end that people are really not that keen to go to war with their grandparents over these types of issues. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't act. And there is a real concern about the inequality implications of this. I mean, as again, the report and Molly's work makes so clear, the story of the last few decades is the growth of private wealth, even if it's shifted back a little bit recently. And then the second story is the concentration of that within a particular cohort towards the higher end of the age range. But then the third element of that is that's concentrated within that cohort among the top third. So it's going to flow down very unevenly to the next generations. And that is a real worry, how that will cement advantage and disadvantage intergenerationally. And that, in turn, gives us concerns about what does it do to faith in the system as a whole if we don't address that very unequal downward flow. So just a final point from me is that I came to the end of the book on generations thinking that generational thinking is incredibly important and useful as long as we separate out the myths from realities. But in the end, what I concluded is that our real issue is not intergenerational or looking at individual generations. It is short-term thinking and a lack of a long-term view on these issues across so many of the topics, policy areas that you look at. The real issue is short-termism and that lack of a long-term view, which is why I think the recommendations here are really important, that we should be looking at pensions and savings at a young age, because that's when it really matters for people, taking that longer whole life course perspective on this. And then the intergenerational pooling of risk using with-profit products and other things are exactly the right places to be looking. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Bobby. And sorry about the sound, wherever it was caused from, whether or your end, but there was the occasional drop off. But it wasn't enough to stop us listening, I think, to some of the important points you made. And one in particular, I'd like to pick up using Chairman's prerogative in our now Q&A session that will run for about 20 minutes. And that was your observation that within generations, the flow is inconsistent and uneven, and particularly with inheritance. I mean, how can we get a more even flow going down the generations? Because it seems to be a little bit of random luck at the moment, whether you're born with wealthy parents or people who don't have quite so much wealth and so on. But do you have any policy ideas as to how that might be smoothed?
Well, I mean, we really struggle with wealth taxation in the UK. It's a difficult discussion for us to have, and inheritance is particularly fraught, and lots of policy interventions have hit the rocks on that. But I think this has become such an issue that we need to engage with that more clearly. And we're doing a strand of work with Fairness Foundation and others on exactly those types of issues. How do you get that to work? I think it's a difficult sell, and some of it is based on people's misperceptions of what they actually. It's a political view that's based on public's misperceptions of what does this actually mean for me as an individual. But we also have to engage with the fact that we are quite a meritocratic country in many ways. When you look at internationally and you look at the different perceptions of meritocracy, that people should be allowed to make money for themselves and pass it on to their kids without too much interference, we come pretty mid-Atlantic in our overall attitude. So the starting point in the UK is not that. It is not as strongly interventionist as we see in some other countries, particularly in Europe. So it is a difficult thing to engage with, but something that I think we're going to have to. And you do see, we do see the links, increasingly seeing the analytical links between that extreme wealth inequality and people's questioning of the system, and that leaving space for people to come up with more radical solutions, more populist solutions that is effectively ripping up the system. So I think it's coming to the point where we will need to engage more seriously in this.
More to come on that one then, Bobby. We look forward to it. I think some of these problems are quite difficult to address, certainly from my perspective. But let me sort of broaden out the Q&A part of our time together now, and just ask perhaps Clive or Vivi if they want to highlight or pick out or disagree with any of the comments which Bobby and Molly have made. I mean, can I look for a volunteer? Clive or Vivi, but if not, let me use Chairman's prerogative then to fill up.
Sorry, Lawrence. I will. I'll
Well
step
done.
into the void for you there. So I was just just resonating with some of the comments that Bobby made there, and in terms of intergenerational wealth and what's mine and what's yours, we have had a long history of property laws. So everything is very neatly owned by a person, and including your wealth, and particularly your invested wealth. And as an investment manager, as a pension provider, we take a lot of time and trouble that we actually know whose money is whose, and we collect it and we keep it safe and give it back to the same person. And in an interesting way, this concept of wealth being generational challenges some of that every pound owned by a particular person, and provides some barriers for it moving between generations. And I wonder whether that's one of the things that we've, for very good reasons, built with controls and safety within our within our system. And now we want to say, well, in actual fact, can we pass it down more freely? I'm not talking about tax. I'm just talking about the mechanics of that, and a very Western view that everything is owned by an individual. Is that actually something that's we're kind of nibbling at the edges there? And just one further thought on generational, because people are living longer, actually a lot of wealth is passed not to the children, but actually to the grandchildren, and there you tend to see a much wider range of circumstances, and whether in considering that, charitable giving should also be, that's where, how much should you give into your own view of worthy causes, as well as back into the system. I am now the second oldest in 4 generations in our family, as my father is approaching 100, and I'm sure those in the ILC will tell me that type of setup is becoming much more common, and perhaps we should expand our thinking to incorporate that as well.
Okay, thank you, Clive. The same idea about passing wealth to charities had occurred to me as well, because I think the UK has got quite a good system of incentivizing wealth transfer into the charitable sector. And I myself had just wondered whether that might be a base for loosening out more broadly, but to individuals rather than the charities. But I'll just leave that thought unfinished, as it clearly is. And I'm going to pick up the word tax and so on that Bobby raised before, because on one of Molly's slides, she said taxation on property is a bit of an issue that should be looked at. And I wonder, Molly, if I could bring you in just to add a few words as to what you had in mind, and perhaps any particular changes to taxation on property that you might be advocating from Resolution Foundation?
Yeah, so we did a bit of a deep dive into our property tax system last summer, I think, and ultimately our main property tax is council tax, and it's hugely regressive and extremely out of date, so it needs addressing. We've got a situation where very valuable properties are paying less council tax in London than less valuable properties in the northeast, and I think that needs addressing. So ultimately, the first thing that needs to happen is a revaluation, because it's based on council tax is based on property values from 30 years ago. or longer. And eventually, it would be great to move to a proportional property tax system. We appreciate that would be really difficult because it would create, while it would create lots of winners, lots of people would see their council tax bills fall, it would create some losers. And it tends to be the losers that tend to be very vocal about changes in taxes, which makes it difficult to do sensible things. So what we proposed is that initially, local authorities should be able to set their own proportional property tax so that they generate the same level of revenue from their council tax, and then eventually it gets rebalanced over the entire country by adjusting the government local funding formula over time. But the thing is, it is a complicated proposal, and it would need to be introduced over a long period. So you really need to get, you know, cross-party buy-in to do something sensible like this. And it's, you know, it's not a new policy proposal. Lots of people think the sensible thing to do is a proportional property tax or a land value tax, but it's just very difficult to achieve politically, despite it being a you know, more sensible than the current situation that we've got.
Okay, Molly, thank you for explaining that. And I suppose the government has got 4 years to think about reform to taxation, because they've promised not to meddle too much, I think, in the nearer term. But we'll see how that one goes as well. I'm still going to turn to other members of the panel to say, is there any other point that anyone wants to come in with arising from our discussion? Otherwise, I'll turn to some of the questions which have been raised in the chat, but just give you the chance to come in if you would like to. It takes a few seconds to click over, doesn't it, from one individual to another? But even allowing for that, I think, well, let's address some of the questions which have come into the chat. And this one, Clive, I'll warn you, is for you first off. And it's from Rob Ewell, I think, who is with the ABI, who says intergenerational fairness is one of the concerns sometimes raised about collective DC pensions due to the fear that payments to current pensioners will be prioritised. But this can be avoided. Could you say how the interests of the younger and older members are best balanced, learning from with profits? So I think that's a natural one for you, Clive, even if there might not be an answer.
No, thank you very much. The reason why we see there's an analogy between with-profit funds and that intergenerational process within our society is the funds face exactly that. How do you act fairly? And a lot of it is the investment performance for the length you stay within the fund, but there is checks and balances and some regulation around perhaps a more refined sense of calculation and a more codified sense of fairness in the very, albeit the narrower sense of how do you pay, how much do you get of the returns that a fund has made based on your duration and how much you put in. So it is a very well governance process, and it is something that has been refined over a number of years. So it's actually different to CDC, which is very new and untested. So you could look to because I would suggest the way, rather than trying to anticipate all the issues, a lot of it is facing different economic situations and learning from those and incorporating it within your practice. So this is a practical outworking of fairness. And because the with-profit funds are long-lived, ours is 175 years, and because with the practice, the actuarial mathematics, and actually the governance and regulations surrounding it, there is a body of practice and insight that may, in some senses, be useful elsewhere. I think Bobby mentioned intergenerational accounting, which often is used for major projects, but I think we're getting into that as an analogous process. I don't know whether I've interpreted that correctly. I'm sure Bobby will put me right if I have.
Okay, well, just in the interests of transparency here, I should say that Rob, in directing his question to Clive, also said that I might want to comment on it. So I guess I better have, otherwise Rob will be emailing me this afternoon. And it's a great question, I think, Rob. I think from my perspective, the solutions lie in transparency of governance. I think that with profits got a bit of a bad reputation at some points in the past, largely because it wasn't obvious what was going on, and therefore it wasn't obvious that it was being run well or run fairly. So I think addressing those issues, which are clearly addressable, indeed, we've now got the principles and practices of financial management and so on as documents to try and explain to people what's going on. I think more comment, I think, from the press on the excellence of those is always something that might build confidence in complicated or complex, I should say, financial investments. So I'll just try that one as my contribution to the debate. But let me turn now to Tony Zellinger, I think, who's put a couple of questions in the chat. The first one a bit provocative, I think. It said, should UK newborns be automatically auto-enrolled? I mean, has the 2017 reforms gone far enough at saying bring down the age to 17 or 18? I mean, why not start at 0? Anyone like to come in on that?
I mean, I can have a go. I think it is one of the recommendations in the report, not automatic enrollment, but opening up savings accounts for children, maybe not newborns, I don't know, but and it is more about trying to encourage that culture of savings, because I think evidence does show that obviously we know from how compound interest works that even if you're just saving a little bit each month or each year, it builds up, and the earlier you start, the better it is. And I think at the moment there is a lot of sort of inequality in terms of who has access, because it depends on you or your parents remembering to open such a savings account. And I think actually democratizing that could have a beneficial impact. I don't know if anyone wants to add to that or disagree. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Vivi, for that. There's another similar question in the chat as well, which says, given the recent maturation of child trust funds established under the previous Labour government, should the current government look to implement similar schemes to support the wealth of future generations? And I think that's one of your recommendations, Vivi, isn't it? Shall I pass straight back to you?
Yes, I think this sort of builds up on the previous point. And I think it is something that, in terms of providing that extra incentive for people to start saving, would definitely be beneficial. Of course, the sort of challenge there is, as with all government policy, is the trade-offs involved. So if you're going to implement this policy, what do you have to sacrifice? And I think, like, as an initial step, providing savings accounts for everyone from a young age would be a good starting point that could be achieved at a lower cost. But ideally, I think some sort of program where the government does give these incentives earlier on would be beneficial.
Okay, thank you. Let me turn now to a question for you, Molly, I think, which is from Judy Brown, and she raises a very interesting point here. She says, regarding Molly's chart on page 16, I think, on increased wealth, I presume that more of that growth is tied up in property values. So not necessarily tangible benefit unless they downsize substantially. Would you like to comment on that as a concept, and how we can get property more fungible?
Yeah, so it is a good point. A lot of the increase in wealth since, well, post the financial crisis has been in both property and actually the value of DB pensions as well. And again, you don't tend, well, particularly on DB pensions, you don't tend to feel wealthier if the value of that promise increases, because you're ultimately going to have the same income stream later down the line. And similarly with property, you don't feel wealthier until you realize that capital gain by selling the property. But what is really important, I think, when you do the intergenerational comparison, is that the fact that we have had these capital gains indicates that how difficult it is for younger generations to accumulate the same amount of wealth. So yes, while you might not feel wealthier in a property that has increased in value, what it does indicate is that it's become much harder for someone without that to then build up the same levels of wealth. Again, with DB pensions, they have become more valuable. Well, they became more valuable in a low interest rate world because it was much harder for people without DB pension promises to save the amount of money that would be needed to provide the same income stream later on. So it's yeah, I recognize the point that it's only when you realize these capital gains that you feel wealthier, but the comparison between generations and between those that have the wealth and don't have the wealth is an important one to make.
Okay, thanks very much, Molly. And now an international question, as this is the International Longevity Centre. So it's good to have some comments from other nationalities. And this is from Mark Benning, who says, at what point in the education in the UK is life course financial and savings being introduced into the curriculum? Seems to me it needs more, as it is here in Canada. Are we doing enough to socialise and I mean, the concept of the intergenerational contract? Is there more that we can done on financial literacy and so in a formal way? Anyone want to come in on that?
I can, if you like, or just briefly.
Thanks,
Yes, no, there isn't much. There are. It's not core curriculum. There's elements that you can put into some more flexible parts of the curriculum. It's one of those things that one of the most common go-to levers that people have when we're wanting to influence behavior is to stick it in the curriculum. And you do worry about those types of responses because there's so much pressure on school curricula, so difficult to change. When I was first starting on generational analysis, I was talking to head of the National Statistics, ONS, about exactly these types of things, and his response was it was better to be going after politicians and the media in terms of getting the message. They're easier to do that than get things on the school curriculum in the UK because it's so convoluted and difficult to do. I think it is in the spirit of this being an intergenerational problem that needs to start young, I do think we do have an issue with financial literacy and being able to bring that in more. But looking to schools to solve it is going to be really tough to achieve in practice. And I think we'll need multiple interventions to try to get that to work. And I do sort of go back to the recommendations of the report that this is often learnt by doing as well as by teaching. So the actual engagement with auto-enrollment in savings accounts, and then I think the question was more about auto-enrollment in pensions. I think the more practical and close to people's actual life decisions you make it, the better. So I think rather than trying to teach it, get people to experience it would be my suggestion.
Okay, thank you for that, Bobby. And there's another question which I think is directed at you as well in the chat. And this is, it says, Professor Duffy stressed the strong generational contract. However, I prefer the phrase, good parents, poor citizens. The older generations are supporting the younger generations and vice versa. But there are huge transfers through government debt also. These are not small, and older generations do not seem to have internalized this into their decision-making, or more accurately, voting intentions. Is this part of the short-termism that you were talking about?
Well, I mean, short answer is yes, that is part of it. It's quite difficult for people to imagine across generations. And actually, David Willits and Resolution Foundation, a lot of David's motivation on this was exactly what are we storing up for future generations in terms of doing that. And I think it is absolutely the case that when you look at the preferences of the public, they are older generations are sympathetic towards younger generations, but they still do tend to prioritize things that benefit them, and that their voting intentions do tend to follow that, more so in some ways than younger people penalizing older generations for the reasons that we talked about earlier in this. And I kind of, I suppose this does go back to that need for trying to encourage us to have that longer term view. And in the book and in a lot of my presentations and talks on this, there is this lovely concept of the 200-year life that Elise Boulding came up with, a sociologist, which is very personal in many ways, because I think of it, I've got a 200-year life in many ways, because my grandparents were born in the 1910s. My kids are going to live to the 2110s. So this is not that, it seems like a long period of time, but it's actually quite personal period of time, that I will have personally known and loved people that have got this 200-year age span, and trying to get some more of that thinking into our own minds and into our policy and decision making, I think is key. You've got to make it personal to people, that we do have these deep connections over quite a long period when you start to think of it in those terms.
Okay, thanks. Let me go on to Doug Andrews' question. It was to Vivi. It says, can Vivi explain how the democratizing savings from birth would actually work? Is it making more products available with favorable taxation, but still voluntary savings? Or is it suggested that there'll be some form of mandatory saving? Vivi.
Yes. So our suggestion is to have something that's voluntary. And I guess sort of building a little bit on Bobby's point, the sort of reasoning behind it is this thinking that even just having basically sort of thinking about the way we make financial decisions, having information is part of the problem, and that's where initiatives that focus on financial literacy are important. But there is a lot of this sort of learning by doing and by making decisions easy for people. And part of the rationale, I think, for having the savings account, it's not to force people to save, but it's to sort of make it that much easier to try and to sort of instill those habits early on. I hope that answers the question.
Okay, thanks. Okay, thanks. I was saying, sorry, I'll mute again. That Judy Brown has put a number of questions into the Q&A. I'll just perhaps pick up one of them. It's another taxation question, I'm afraid. It says that current pensions contribution allowance, tax relief, at 20%, 40% or 45%, contribute to pensions inequality and compound differences of the individual's long-term pension potential. What are the speaker's views on making this more even and attractive to all? For example, with an overall 30% tax relief. Anyone want to comment on pensions taxation? Well, it doesn't seem as if... Well done, Molly, come on, well done, rescue me.
I can give a brief answer. I think our perspective at the Resolution Foundation is that the actual income tax relief that you get when putting money into a pension is probably okay, because you want to particularly encourage higher and middle earners to do a lot of pension savings if you're using a measure of replacement rates, because a lot of low income people will get a lot of replacement from the state pension. However, that's not to say that there aren't problems in the way that we tax pensions. The fact that we have a 25% tax-free lump sum feels a bit wasteful. So, you know, very wealthy people can withdraw £250,000 tax-free. That I don't know what the rationale behind that is, but our view is that that should be reduced and come down to more sensible levels. But yeah, on the other side, on the income tax thing, I think we're fairly comfortable with those incentives.
Okay, no, thank you, Molly. I thought you got part of your wish, because the tax-free lump sum has come down a bit, not quite to 250, and you might have ambitions for it to go beyond that, of course, but at least a step in that direction has been taken. But perhaps I might give you my perspective on this topic, Judy, because it seems to me that if you've got a progressive tax system, it's axiomatic that you've got a regressive tax relief system, and it clearly favours higher earners, the pensions tax relief system in the UK, and yet I think by common consent more of the problems are with lower earners. So I naturally felt quite supportive of a flat rate system at around about 30%, actually, the figure that you've selected. And I mean, I'm not sure whether I'm allowed on an ILC seminar to talk about the Pensions Policy Institute, but to let me transgress, and I'll ask for forgiveness later. But I mean, they produced a report about 6 or 7 years ago that in which they said that the 30% flat rate was actually the point at which all ambitions were fulfilled. I don't know what the merits of that, and I must say, if I'm allowed a casual observation on society, I was a little bit disappointed that the reasons why this wouldn't be entertained at the current time was because of high earners in the public sector. And there was something a little bit not quite right, I think, in the way I felt about that, but I shouldn't talk too much about my personal feelings. But let's move on to another question. And this one is anonymous, so I can't say who put it in, but it was for a fund that gives lower returns, but invests in healthy aging infrastructure and health. But not necessarily in the USA. Anyone want to pick that up?
I think you've frozen. You froze
there. I'm frozen, I'm told. It's not too cold in here. You can hear me? Sorry. Okay, repeat the question. Apparently I've become unfrozen, which is nice. But this is a question from anonymous, who says, is there a case for a commercial fund that gives lower returns but invests in healthy aging infrastructure and healthy aging businesses? So something with a great social purpose. For a fund, anyone want to take that? Clive, can I ask you to come in on it? No,
I think yeah, you were a little broke up a little bit. The ether was against you, but I think I've
I think we've got some problems with the technology. Clive, you're in.
Yeah, I think your question was: is there a role for a fund which might give a lower return but invest in I think it was I didn't quite get the area, but something with a social purpose that might give a lower return. If I was to unpack that for a little bit, I think the point of our motivation in this, and particularly where you can live a substantive and a fund with a long view, is to invest in those types of assets. That's the term may not be familiar to people, but that's sometimes what we call private assets. They can be things from solar farms, wind farms, social housing, and so on and so forth. At the moment, I'm going to slightly dodge the question. It's quite difficult to construct a fund where to get that right, and something that be attractive to people, and the quantum of those who are interested would be a very important part here. But actually, we probably with our knowledge of that private asset market, a lot of those assets do have are impactful from a climate perspective, are investing in new technologies, or actually have other social good like medical innovation, or helping particular types of individuals within our society get their ideas to market by funding early stage those entrepreneurs, early stage funding, all of which falls into the definition of private assets, because it's not investing buying shares on a stock market, basically. We believe those can give good returns. They require long investments, and they require some technical aspects that we believe things like with profit funds are well placed to provide. And an example with that is people generally want to put their money in when they want to and take it out when they want to. A lot of the things that we've just talked about in there, that you can't sell 1% of a wind fund to pay somebody who wants their pension. They're what we call illiquid, and therefore you have to have a mechanism to provide people with that liquidity so they can take the money out when they want to, even if the underlying assets they're investing in aren't sold. So there are a number of aspects around there that I think, and a lot of government initiatives and expectation that for providing tax relief, to reference the question earlier, that we could reasonably expect that more of our pension money was invested in those types of assets where literally you could see the things being built from where you live, rather than investing in a large corporation. Let's say one of the large digital businesses in the States, where it's just a transaction that you can't see anything physically from that perspective. So I hope I've answered the question in a way that's productive going forwards. Back to you, Lawrence.
Okay, thank you very much indeed, Clive. Well, a great answer to a very perceptive question. Now, I've got one eye on the clock, and we've just got less than 5 minutes remaining. So what I'm going to do is going to turn to our 4 contributors today and ask them if there's just one policy or one initiative they'd like to see go forward as a result of this discussion to strengthen the intergenerational contract. What would it be? Quickly, Vivi, over to you.
So I think, so to some extent, building on Clive's point, making it easier for funds to invest in productive assets would be a good way forward. And I know there's a lot of sort of will on the part of government, but I think there's a gap between what the government is sort of aiming for and the reality. So that would be my number 1.
Okay, and Molly, I'll come to you next.
Yes, I think the policies that I outlined in the presentation to help tackle the challenges with wealth accumulation among younger cohorts is really important, because that will give people a stake in society. And so yeah, it's good to see that we're moving forward on sort of house building targets, but I think there's more to be done on the pension side of things.
Okay, and Bobby?
Yeah, I mean, it's probably more prompted by Molly's response, but typically in these sessions, I would say that there is no intergenerational contract without a more comprehensive solution to housing in the UK. And that is not just ownership, it is private renting and social housing. It has to be looked at as systemically to cover the generation as a whole, not just think of this as a wealth asset, but it's actually how people live.
Okay, and finally, Clive.
Excellent, thanks. My way into this is not a policy. It's just that, and the reason we were putting our shoulder to the wheel in this, we believe that intergenerational contract, perhaps I always think defined by that graph earlier in the presentation, is the way our society works. And I think we probably need to spend a little bit more time explaining to people that that is how it works, to make sure it evolves and adapts for the future. Because if it wasn't there, we'd live in a very different place.
Okay, thank you, Clive. And it just left for me, I think, to bring the proceedings to an end and to thank Vivi very, very much for her excellent research, and you, Clive, for the sponsorship, but also to Molly and to Bobby for their expert contributions today. We've learned an awful lot from them. And my final thanks goes to everyone who tuned in for this webinar and for the great set of questions that you sent through. And we hope we've been able to do justice to most of those in the time we had available. Thank you very much indeed, and have a good day.